So when we first built this model, we just used consumer spending and investment spending in order to get an idea of how the model worked. But now we're going to add both government spending and then net exports into the model and see how it changes. So government enters aggregate demand in two ways. First of all is government spending. That's our G, right? So government spending includes spending on construction, on military, on teachers, on police and firefighters. All of that is part of government spending. It's exogenous, and so it will shift our aggregate demand curve upward or downwards. Remember, it doesn't necessarily depend on current income. It's also going to enter through consumption spending because it is going to depend on the tax rate, right? And so when we said that consumer spending depended on income, really what it depends on is disposable income. And so instead of putting y into our consumption function, we're going to put 1 minus t, where t is the tax rate, times y. And then we're going to add for investment, which is going to depend on the interest rate and the after-tax rate of profit. And so that government policy then can shift investment up or down as well, depending on what it does with the interest rate, with monetary policy, and what it does with the tax rate in terms of fiscal policy. What about net exports? Well, remember, net exports are exports minus imports. Exports is taken as exogenous. It's going to shift up aggregate demand up or down depending on what's going on in other economies, right? So if one of the countries that we export a lot to has a recession, then those exports are probably going to fall. Imports, we're going to model as how much we spend on imports. So what's our marginal propensity to import? We're just going to call that little m. And so little m times y is how much we spend on imports. So for the United States, imports are like 0.16 approximately of GDP, about 16%. So we can put this all together, okay? So now our aggregate demand is C0 plus C1 times 1 minus TY, that's our consumption, plus investment, which now will be a function of the interest rate, R, plus government spending, which is going to be exogenous, depends on what the politicians decide, plus exports, which are also exogenous, that depends on what's going on in other countries, minus M times Y, that's our imports. So saving, taxation, and imports are all things that can cause spending to leak out of our circular flow diagram, right? So if taxes are high, that money goes to the government, and so it doesn't get spent. If imports are high, then that money gets sent to other countries, right? And so that doesn't get spent. It gets spent in those other countries. And so those things can all reduce the size of the multiplier. Higher taxes, higher imports, that can all reduce the size of the multiplier. And if there's a smaller multiplier, that means we have a flatter aggregate demand curve, right? And so with a flatter aggregate demand curve, we won't get quite as many shocks. So how can the government then stabilize the economy, right? Well, there's a few ways. One is that if we're in a recession, government spending can increase, right? Government spending is large and at least on the federal side is exogenous. And so if we're in a recession, the government can say, all right, well, we'll borrow some money and spend it. We can spend it on building roads, on building schools, on whatever we want to spend it on that puts people to work. We can change the tax rate, right? So that can change the multiplier. We can do transfers too. Now, transfers are tricky because they aren't really part of G, right? They're not really part of government spending. But we can borrow and increase unemployment insurance when unemployment rate goes up, and that helps people smooth consumption, which we know also reduces the multiplier. And we can also, intervene via fiscal policy, which is what if you get in a recession, you increase spending or you cut taxes, that's really what fiscal policy is all about. Now, some of these are what are referred to as automatic stabilizers, things that happen automatically when the economy goes into a recession because of laws that Congress has already passed previously, right? So unemployment benefits. More people get unemployment benefits when the unemployment rate goes up. That means that they can smooth consumption better. That means the multiplier is lower. Proportional tax rates. When your tax rate goes up when your income goes up and goes down when your income goes down, that means during a recession, tax revenue goes down. That means disposable income doesn't fall by as much as it otherwise would That helps people smooth their consumption as well. That helps stabilize the economy. But that doesn't require new laws, right? That's why they're called automatic stabilizers. Whereas discretionary fiscal policy, things like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was passed in 2009, do require new laws. It can take time. It can make problems because of political compromises, and so most economists think that automatic stabilizers usually are the most beneficial. One of the interesting things about the macroeconomy is that when households make perfectly rational decisions, they can end up having unintended consequences. And one of the examples of that is what's known as the paradox of thrift. And the idea with the paradox of thrift, thrift just meaning savings, is that if a lot of households all try to save more at the same time, that means spending goes down. That means output and income go down, which means spending goes down even more. And so now people were worried about a recession, and their behavior, their increase in savings, has made that recession more likely or worse. And so this is one thing that is important to think about is this fallacy of composition, where politicians especially like to compare the government budget to a household, right? And so when times are tough for a household, they say, "Oh, we got to tighten our belt, we got to, do what's right." But that's not necessarily true for the whole economy, right? The government can play a role in the economy that a household can't. And that's because, for one thing, the government is infinitely lived. The government can continuously borrow money, whereas a household cannot, right? A household is going to have to pay back what it borrows, and is not going to have continuously growing income to pay off that debt. So governments can try to counteract a fall in aggregate demand via fiscal stimulus, right? Which is either going to be cutting taxes or increasing spending. So the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 involved both. It was about $800 billion, about half tax cuts and about half spending increases. And the idea is if we're at point A, at the business cycle peak, and then we get a recession and we fall down to point B, then the goal of fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus, is to get us back. We would like to get back to point A, but even if that's not possible, maybe get us back to point C, somewhere in between. And so most economists do think that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009 was successful in making the recession less bad than it was, but it clearly was not successful in terms of, getting us back to where we started. It took us really 5 years to get back to where we were. So it wasn't really until 2014 that the economy had mostly recovered. And a lot of economists don't think the economy has fully recovered yet because of the lower participation rate in the labor market. So when we think about fiscal stimulus, we need to think about the government's budget. And so the budget balance is taxes minus government spending. And for this purpose, I guess we're including transfers in government spending, right? And so the key thing about a stimulus is that, with automatic stabilizers especially, but with any kind of fiscal stimulus, tax revenue goes down and spending goes up. And that means that during a recession, we expect that governments will have a government budget deficit, right? Um, and that's definitely what happened. So we came in with a small deficit, the United States federal government did in 2008. And then in 2009, tax revenue fell and we started spending more. And so the budget deficit grew to about 10% of GDP, which was the largest deficit we've had since World War II. And so one of the problems was that we had a surplus in the late 90s, but we had cut taxes in 2001 and 2003, which meant that we had a deficit going into the recession. So when we hit the recession, the deficit got even bigger. And so we are still not really anywhere near a government budget surplus, which is when taxes are greater than spending and transfers. One of the sort of ill-advised policies that came out of the recession was this idea of austerity. And the idea was that if we cut spending and reduce our budget deficit, then that will help the economy grow. It was never exactly clear why it would help the economy grow. There was talk that it would increase business confidence. Um, but what we saw, this was mostly tried in European countries, and some of them had no choice because they just didn't have enough tax revenue and they didn't have enough borrowing capacity to increase spending. Was that those countries that practice austerity policy by cutting government spending instead of increasing government spending saw their GDP fall even farther. And so Greece was the prime example of that. And the fact was that they didn't have much choice because there was no one that was willing to lend to them during the recession because their economy was in such bad shape that nobody's willing to buy their bonds because they didn't believe they would be paid back. So we can think of this, sort of in four quadrants where we get these positive and negative feedback mechanisms, right? Where we have private sector decisions and we have sort of dampening mechanisms that offset shocks, such as consumption smoothing. We can have amplifying mechanisms that reinforce shocks, like credit constraints, uh, changing value in assets, like especially housing, and rising capacity utilization and booms that add to even more investment, adding to the boom. Um, and government policy and central bank decisions, where we can have automatic stabilizers that help things stable, make the multiplier lower. We can have fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus during recessions. But then we can also have policy mistakes, right? Like we talked about with Greece, with Spain, with Italy, where they practiced austerity, they cut government spending, and GDP got even worse. So in practice, the multiplier depends on the marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to import, and the tax rate, in our theory, in our little model. But in reality, it's going to depend on a lot of other things too, right? So one is the rate of capacity utilization. And so basically, how much more could firms produce if they wanted to? So if they are fully employed, right, if they're producing at the maximum amount, then an increase in government spending is going to do what we call crowding out private spending. So, and that's because we just can't produce anymore. The government buys something, that means somebody else has to buy less. But during a recession, capacity utilization is very low. And so if the government buys something during a recession, that doesn't necessarily crowd out private spending. They can both be high because firms can meet that demand. Expectations are also going to be important, right? And so the multiplier could be very different depending on how business and consumers sort of expect the future to be, and that could depend on what that policy is, right? If the fiscal deficit makes consumers and businesses really worried, then that might be bad, and that was one of the arguments for austerity. But as we saw, it didn't really pan out that way.